Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Jack Westin MCAT podcast, and specifically a CARS reading skills workshops. So you'll be joined today by your hosts, Molly and Jack. Jack, I feel like we've covered so many different types of passages in these workshops, and this one, of all of them, is probably the most relevant to medicine that we've done so far.
Yeah, this is actually something you might actually read in medical school, right? Like
Hmm.
under or maybe even residency. But like this is something you like an article that might be applicable to you and your work, right? So
Yeah.
I definitely think the topic is interesting about the actual arguments and the ideas and finding them might still be a little.
Yeah. I feel like this, of course, in a podcast like this, we're going to go through one of our CARS daily passages. This one's called Chronic Illness. It's the daily passage from August 6th. We've done a lot of different passages. Of course, CARS, there's a ton of diversity. You may see history or archaeology or political science or philosophy. This one is very medically relevant, talking about basically the burden of chronic illness on individuals and their families. So I'm pretty excited. Whenever I see passages like this in CARS, it makes me very excited, but it also makes me a little nervous because whenever we have topics that are really close to our own interests or things that we have a lot of knowledge and experience about, we just have to make sure, as always, that we leave all of our thoughts and feelings and opinions and perspectives at the door when we come in to evaluate this passage. So we're going to have to stay on top of that today, even if you know other things about this topic, or maybe you've had a relative or a sibling or somebody that had a chronic illness. Make sure you are not bringing that in. It'll only confuse you when you get to the questions. Um, so that's something that we'll keep in mind. Again, in a CARS reading skills workshop like this, we're going to go through every sentence of each paragraph. We'll pull out what we need to in order to help us understand the author's key arguments. And we'll kind of course, mentally map as we go. Although, of course, if you're interested in talking about mapping and some of our other Jack Westin CARS strategies, definitely come see us in one of our free classes that we hold each week. Um, Alrighty, Jack. I think we're ready to hop in with paragraph one. What do you think? Is there
Yeah,
anything you want to add?
no, that's it. I mean, that's great. Let's do it.
All right. So let's go ahead and get started. Let's read the first sentence of paragraph one. It says, in general, the field of pediatric chronic illness care has not kept pace with the demographic changes that now characterize our society. Changes that have the potential to profoundly affect child and family functioning. Okay, so this first sentence, again, hits really close to home for a lot of us that are very motivated towards medicine. And we do get an argument. We're talking about PCI, pediatric chronic illness, and how it has essentially not kept pace with social change. Um, there's a lot of text in this sentence, but I think that's the ultimate message that I would want to track.
Right. I would say before the colon, right? Like all that
Yeah.
info right before the colon. So PCI, pediatric chronic illness, has not kept pace with demographic changes. Okay, so
Hmm.
demographic changes that now characterize our society. That sounds like a mouthful. Like, what does that mean? Demographic
Hmm.
changes that now characterize our society. It just sounds like social change, right?
Yeah.
Like, it hasn't like something to do with like people, demographic, right?
Hmm.
Changes, like we know what that is, and our society. So societal changes, like I think that's a pretty good way of looking at it. So yeah, okay, let's keep going.
Awesome.
And this is important because it establishes what we're talking about, which should be pretty interesting, right? This is something
Mhm.
that might be relevant to many pre-medical students who go down medicine, right? And specifically in pediatrics. And so, just following along, understanding what's going on, I think is really important. But you did make a really good point. This is an argument. We don't know if PCI has kept pace with social changes or hasn't,
Mhm.
right? The author in this case is making the claim that it hasn't, right?
Mhm.
Probably, right? But who knows? So
Yeah.
you gotta just understand the context behind this. Like, why has it not? what specifically has been altered because of this, right? So
Yeah.
we'll just keep reading and we'll understand it more.
Yeah. And also, what does it even mean to keep pace with that? Like, what does that actually mean? We'll
Yeah.
have to find out.
Yeah. That's tricky too.
Yeah. Okay, let's look at sentence two. It says a recent review of the impact of family structure on family income revealed that financial resources for lone parents were only 55% of those of married parent families. Okay, so in the sentence before, we really did have that argument, right? That PCI did not keep pace with demographic changes or social change. It seems like we've got a fact now about social change. Basically, we're seeing differences between lone parents and married parent families, especially in terms of income. I'm, to me, just tracking, okay, this might be part of that social or demographic change or
Right.
differences or diversity. But to me, this doesn't feel as strong as far as an argument as the sentence before.
Yeah, it's not really an argument. It's more about like what the social change is, right?
Yeah.
Like, okay, lone parents were only 55% of those married. So like they didn't have as much financial resource compared to
Hmm.
married parent families.
Yeah.
And so we have to just understand one parent versus two parents. One parent didn't have as much financial resource, which could be a change, right? A societal.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's probably like one of the factors or context behind it, which is important. We have to build the context as
Hmm.
we understand it better. And this is where your point, Molly, where you said don't bring in your own opinions, right? Because to other people, social change could be, I don't know, like how, like
Religion or something.
religion.
There's a million.
Yeah, something to do with race or something to, who knows, right? In our society, everything's always constantly changing. So in this case, it's money, right? Money related. And at least not just money related in terms of people, but in terms of couples, right? Are you a couple or are you not a couple? So,
Hmm.
okay, sounds good.
Yeah. Okay. One other sentence in this paragraph, it says, even more striking, children in lone parent families are more than 4 times as likely to live in poverty as those in married parent families across all race and ethnic categories. So this is another like data point, basically. We're still talking about the demographic or social changes, still focused on families versus or lone parent families versus dual parent families. Um, so yeah, it sounds like we're characterizing that. And I feel like it's interesting to recognize that we haven't yet tied this back to PCI, pediatric chronic illness. I kind of feel like maybe we will, but we haven't yet. All we've talked about is just what these social demographic changes look like. So we kind
Good.
of have our context, but
Yeah.
I'm waiting to see how this officially relates back to the argument that we introduced in the first sentence.
Yeah, very good point, right? They didn't mention PCI at all in these last couple sentences. So,
Mhm.
probably the social changes that they were referring to in the first sentence. This is weird. Like it doesn't happen often where like a first paragraph starts with the probably the major argument, right? Like the big
Mhm.
argument has something to do with PCI, has something to do with social change, and then it jumps into like just background info, right?
Yeah.
They kind of build on that argument. So, in school, we're taught always make the first sentence of your first paragraph of your essay the central thesis, right? Like
Mhm.
expand on what it is. And this could, I'm not saying this is the central thesis, but it probably is the topic that we're going to have to deal with throughout the entire essay, right? The entire passage.
Uh-huh.
So, interesting structural analysis of the paragraph. But yeah,
Mhm.
I love that point.
Yeah. And I feel like the point you just made is really important because students ask all the time, like, is it always the first sentence? Is it always the last sentence? Is it always in the middle? And the answer is no to all of those things.
You never
It's,
know.
you never know. You have to be paying attention to every sentence.
Yeah.
You could have a important point at the first sentence and then another important point in the middle and then another important point at the end. You have no idea
Yeah.
within a paragraph or between paragraphs. You just have to keep reading.
Right. And that's because everyone's different, right? And the
Yeah.
human that wrote this has their own way of writing. Just like
Hmm.
how every one of us has a preference, whether we like vanilla ice cream or strawberry ice cream or what, like maybe we don't like ice cream at all. Like everyone's very unique. And so we can't generalize a specific style or specific preference, right, onto every passage, right? That doesn't make sense. So, yeah, great. Let's keep going.
All right. So let's look at paragraph 2. Of course, in paragraph 1, that first sentence about PCI not keeping pace with these changes probably is our most important to track. And let's see if they bring this back to PCI again. It says these findings are particularly salient in the case of pediatric chronic illness, which frequently taxes the economic resources of the family under the best of conditions. Okay, we're back to PCI. We were patient and we've got it now. Um, so we're saying PCI is important and also, or it's especially important in this situation with the lone parents, but PCI creates an economic burden or a financial burden on the family. That's what I'm taking from this.
Yeah. So here's the thing. When someone's reading this quickly, they may accidentally misread it, right? And
Mm,
miscomprehend it. If, I don't know if that's a word, but they basically won't understand exactly what it's saying, right? And so I want to be careful reading this and understand exactly what it's saying. So these findings are particularly salient, so most noticeable in the case of pediatric chronic illness, which we were assuming, right? Like we
yeah.
were assuming this is going to affect those that have lone parents more than well those the parents that are lone parents are more affected, their families are more affected than the ones that have married parents, right, families. So
Hmm.
that's something we already assumed, we already kind of figured out. But the part that is hard to read is the second part, which frequently taxes the economic resources of the family under the best of conditions. That you might read and go, wait a second, does PCI tax the rich? Is that what it? No, that's not what it's saying. Okay. You have to be careful because I know when you see best of conditions, you're probably assuming the families that are really well off. It has nothing to do with that. What it's trying to say in the nicest way possible is that it frequently kind of like, I don't want to say the word hurts because taxing isn't hurt, but it's kind of like taking away, right? Takes something from you, right? It frequently taxes the economic resources of the family under the best of conditions. Basically, it does a really good job taxing people. That's what this
Yeah.
is saying, right? And so if you read it too quickly, you may misread it and you may comprehend it in a different way and it completely alters the way you read this passage, right? And so we want to be careful. And usually they're not going to change their direction so suddenly. So if you feel like something's off, like you read it and you're like, wait a second, why did they just do this 180? Look for at least a contrast word, a however, a but, a yet. That gives you more clues as to how they could transition to the opposite idea, right? And you may continue reading and may figure it out and change the way you read it, right? But be careful, right? Just because you see the words best of conditions, just because you see the way that they write it, you think a certain way, doesn't mean it's always aligned. And so I'd be very careful reading and making sure you understand exactly what it's saying.
Yeah. Yeah, that's super important. Yeah, and it taxes under the best. That makes me feel like maybe in worse conditions it might do worse things than tax you. um that's maybe what we're going to get into. So we've got that preface that this is a financial burden or it's taxing people financially. Let's see what else we say in this paragraph. It says, in response to the increasing number of children growing up in single parent households who must face challenges associated with chronic illness and the dearth of literature specifically focused in this area, a distinguished group of multidisciplinary experts in pediatric psychosocial research of chronic illness was invited to attend a one-day meeting. Whew, what a long sentence. Um, as I was reading, especially realizing how long this sentence was, I was trying to evaluate, is there any part of this that's giving me something totally new? And I would say not really. We're setting up the fact that we're having this meeting, right? We're bringing people together. It does sound like single parent households are getting more common, which was maybe partially implied or referenced in the first paragraph when we talked about social change, in the comparison between single and multi-parent households. Um, and we're getting people together to study it. Long sentence, but it seems like it's setting up this meeting or this study as maybe something that's going to help shed light on our question about PCI and the demographic or social changes.
Yeah, I love this sentence because there isn't a lot there, right? So
There's a lot physically there, but not a lot there
yeah,
under the surface.
right. No argument that's obvious, right? Like nothing obviously important in terms of an idea. I still pay attention, but I know it's setting it up. It's setting up
Exactly.
meeting. So it's probably going to talk more specifically about the meeting. So to me, this is like a moment to relax. It's like, it's like sort of like a mini break, right? So I'm
Yeah.
I'm just reading and I'm not I know I'm not looking for anything specific here, just reading it and understanding it, visualizing it. Okay, let's keep going.
All right. One other sentence here in paragraph 2, it says, this meeting was designed to address three primary questions pertaining to single parents of children living with a chronic or life limiting illness. What do we know? These are all in quotes. What do we need to know? And where do we go from here? So, okay, this is basically like what is the point of the meeting? It's again to get more information about single parents of children with chronic illness. Basically, they again, we're creating a meeting to study what we've established so far. The financial burden on single parent households. Pretty much it.
Sounds good. Yeah. So this paragraph, only thing I would really keep track of is PCI, pediatric chronic illness, taxes, the economic resources of families, right?
Mm,
It takes away because I mean it makes sense, right? I mean, if you have a child that's ill, you're going to need to spend some money helping them,
yeah.
right? And so it makes sense that it affects those who are single parents more than married parents, right?
Mhm.
So all of this makes sense, and now I just need to keep track of this meeting.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, let's move on to paragraph 3 and see what we get into here. Um, First sentence says each expert was to respond to these three basic and fundamental questions from his or her own clinical experiences and programs of research. I feel like this is another sentence that's just kind of that little break that you mentioned earlier. It's like, okay, cool, but like, what did they find? What did they come up with? What was the significance of it? We don't really know yet. Just
Right,
got to keep reading.
right.
Okay, let's look at our second sentence. And this is actually the end of paragraph 3, very short. We were humbled by the dearth of knowledge about the complexity and diversity of the variables affecting the needs and adjustment of all parents, particularly those who care for a child with a chronic illness by themselves, who findings suggest are the most negatively affected. Okay. So, a couple things that jump out at me in this sentence. First of all, that last piece. Okay. Findings suggest are the most negatively affected. They're describing a single parent household. Okay. So, that I think is the actual argument, right? That single parents are the most affected. We get that this is diverse, it's complex. That's, valid too. It's just much less specific. The other thing, though, that I think is really interesting is the we, right? We
Yeah,
were humbled by this. Were
yeah.
you there? That makes me wonder who's the author? Who is we? Are you an expert? Were you part of this meeting? Who are you, author?
Right.
It
Probably a
poses that
pediatric
question.
physician or someone in the field, right? So
Probably, yeah. But definitely the author is citing themselves as part of this group who had these findings. So you have to infer that the author agrees about the findings, right? They were humbled by these findings and this is what they found.
very good point. Very good point. Anytime we see we or my or I, right? Even in this kind of context where it's like kind of a meeting, we know that they are the author or whoever they are agrees with the finding, right? They're
Mm,
part of the meeting, they found this idea, right?
mm,
So this is something we were expecting, but it's very clear now, right? It's establishing it in a very clear argument that single parents most negatively affected by pediatric chronic illness. They're the most negatively affected. So I would just
mm.
know that and understand that, even though it's the last sentence, it kind of clears why this meeting was important.
Yeah. Yeah, and I feel like it's valuable to point out the fact that although it wasn't officially part of the argument, this this idea of single parents being impacted by PCI is really in paragraph 1 and 2 as well. It was brought up in those contexts. It wasn't officially part of the argument, but now it is. Like it's not brand new to talk about single parent households in the passage. It's just new that we're officially involving them in an argument.
That's a really good point. The first paragraph does bring up the fact that pediatric chronic illness has not kept pace with social change, and we understand that social change has something to do with parenting, right?
Mm,
Like specifically financial resources of different parenting, right? Styles. So single parent versus married parent families, right? And you can assume from that that obviously the ones that don't have as much money are negatively impacted, right? But it doesn't say that directly in that first
yeah.
paragraph, and we could probably assume it, right? Second paragraph goes into how financial resources impact families, right? Like specifically pediatric chronic illness families, so the ones that have who
Mm,
suffer from this. So it makes that clear. But here, I think this is like really the first time it's plain said, like in a direct
mhm.
way, right? That most single parents are the most negatively affected. Like we can assume that from the last two paragraphs. It's very clear that financial resources and having a single parent household are affected the most, right? But like here, it's like clear, broad as daylight, like very obvious, right? And
Yeah.
so out of all the paragraphs we've read, we've kind of built up to this, and that's usually what we see is the author will build up to their main point. I'm not saying this is the main point. Like there could be multiple big ideas, right? But this is definitely an idea the author cares about because of that we and because of the way that they structured the passage.
Yeah. Absolutely. Um, cool. Well, we've got still 4 more paragraphs. So, like you said, we could get another idea, but I think that one's important. Let's take a look at paragraph number 4. It says, furthermore, while we all recognized the challenges that single parents must endure in negotiating the financial stressors of having a child with a chronic illness and the caregiving of multiple children in a family, we realized that a primary challenge was to define who should be considered a quote single parent, end quote. Okay, so now we're saying furthermore, or like another point that I'll make, is that we realized it's hard to define single parent. Okay, the middle part, it's like while we all recognize blah blah blah. That's basically saying the the last paragraph is still true, but we also realized this was a component, right? So we're transitioning basically. Um, but again, we see we multiple times in this paragraph. I have to assume that the author was part of this meeting. But either way, they are clearly in alignment with this idea that it's difficult to define a single parent. And I think that's really the argument in this sentence um, that we would want to track. Kind of an
Yep.
interesting idea.
Yeah. Yeah. Defining a single parent. Okay. Sounds good.
Hmm.
And it's difficult, right? We don't know exactly how it's difficult. I mean, single parent to me is obvious, right? Like you're either a
Hmm.
mom or a dad taking care of children, right? But
Hmm.
maybe they have a more specific definition. So let's keep reading. Find it.
Yeah. Okay, what's more, single parents differ by a number of variables such as socioeconomic status, difference or distance from home to hospital, and presence of other children or support figures, all of which altered the potential impact on a single individual meeting the needs of a chronically ill child. Okay, so we're saying what's more. So it's like, okay, it's hard to define single parent. And what's more, it sounds like there's a ton of diversity of factors that influence this impact on a single parent. So it's slightly different. We're not just saying it's hard to define, right? We're saying this group is very diverse, is kind of what I'm getting in their situations. Um,
Very good point. Very good way of articulating it. Yeah, that's great. So just because you're a single parent doesn't mean you're always going to have the same difficulty as every other single parent, right? You may be
mhm.
a single parent and you may be more affected because of these variables, right? So socioeconomic status, distance from home to hospital, Like, for instance, someone who lives farther probably from the hospital is more impacted, even
Yeah.
though they're also a single parent, they're more impacted than someone who lives closer to the hospital, right? So
Yeah.
they're just explaining the variables and
Mhm.
how they may be different within the same group.
Yes. And I feel like just as someone who is very interested in medicine and public health, it's very tempting. Even when I read it's hard to define what's considered a single parent, for me to like sit back and look away from the passage and like ponder for a minute, like, what do I think a single parent is? I think it's this. I think it's this. Don't do that. All of these sentences kind of prompt you to think about what you already know about public health, which is not a bad thing, but it for someone who is either really, really interested in it or um, knows a lot about it, just be careful because you don't want to like basically create support for your own arguments in your head by thinking to yourself what you know about it and what you care about. Just focus on the words, keep the daydreaming and the brainstorming to a minimum because you don't want to basically create like a false memory of reading something that wasn't there because it was just something that you were thinking about from your own knowledge base. Um, so anyway, something to keep in mind if you're
Right.
reading something that you connect with personally. Just try and keep your eyes and your attention on the words that they're using and the specific support that they're presenting so that, you have basically just what the author wants you to know about it. Okay, we have one last sentence in this paragraph. It says, as researchers, we also recognized that we had failed to examine systematically the changes or the challenges that these individuals must face. Okay, so this paragraph as a whole is telling you the findings of the study, right? We got one of the findings in paragraph 3 that single parents were most impacted, but in paragraph 4, we're getting all the other ones. Okay, and they're all slightly different. We get that single parents hard to define. We get that they have very diverse situations and like contexts and factors. And then we also get in this last sentence that they're understudied, right? There's not enough research on it. These are all things that the author and the group of people who met with, these are their findings. Okay. Again, the authors stated that they agree with these things or that they were part of this group. So it's hard to define. It's a diverse group and they're understudied. Those are the things that I'm tracking personally from, this discussion of single parents and this meeting that we've had.
Yeah, it's interesting because technically we could have, like, the author chose to put this fourth paragraph here, but you could have had this before the third paragraph, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's interesting how, like, the key here is understanding their, like, everything that was mentioned here at the level that we just described. That's important. That's testable. They will test you at this level, right? But just knowing from a broader perspective that we're talking about single parents. Like, single
Mm-hmm.
parents is the central focus of this passage. So it
Mm-hmm.
makes sense that the third paragraph where we talked about how single parents are most negatively affected is probably the main argument, right? It's probably one of the main arguments. So this
Mm-hmm.
is just further solidifying that because we're not changing the topic. We're still talking about single parents. So interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah. Okay, cool.
absolutely. Okay, well, let's take a look at our fifth paragraph. It says the literature has generally suggested a reciprocal relationship between chronic illness and parental adaptation, whereby the child's illness impacts the parent's functioning, and parental functioning also influences child adaptation. Okay, so we're kind of seeing the illness affect the parents, and the parents affect the way that the child is responding to the illness. Basically, there's a lot of impact between the parents and the illness. It's reciprocal, which is kind of interesting. It's not the most. It's pretty clear. It's not the most direct to like summarize. I could imagine it in my head as like illness and then an arrow, like a double-headed arrow, and parental adaptation. Like illness changes adaptation, and changes the illness. But it's kind of hard to summarize in words beyond what they've said.
Well, yeah, I mean, I would be careful because it says the child's illness impacts the parent's functioning. That makes sense, right? Like,
Hmm.
child is really ill, the parent probably can't function as well, right? Like it's harder to do. But then the second part, the parent functioning also influences child adaptation, not illness, child adaptation. So I don't understand what that means. That part kind of is weird and confusing. But you're right. As long as you know there's some sort of reciprocal nature behind this where they're impacted kind of inversely, right? I would just keep reading and see if it clears it up.
Yeah, which I bet it will. And that's true. I again, I'm thinking, oh, adaptation probably to the illness. Like what would you be adapting to? But that's true. That was very indirect. Um, let's see if they cleared up in the second sentence of paragraph 5. With the onset of illness, families must initiate a number of changes in family routines, structure, and functioning, including redistribution of roles and responsibilities for family members. Okay, I feel like that made a lot more sense. We're basically saying that PCI or pediatric chronic illness changes family routines and roles or responsibilities. Like it impacts the family. It
That sounds like
changes
yeah.
that makes more sense.
Yeah, that sounds like the first half, right? The PCI impacts parents' functioning, so it's redistributing the roles and responsibilities. It's doing something that gives us more context here. I don't
Yeah.
know if it really answers the second half where the parent functioning alters some sort of child adaptation. I don't think it answers that yet, but
Hmm.
definitely understand this part.
Yeah, I agree. Um, okay, let's take a look at our sixth paragraph. There are 7 total, by the way, for anyone that is listening and not looking. Depending on the illness, its severity, and treatment complexity, families may be required to become intensely involved in the care and maintenance of their family member who is ill. Okay, so we're talking now about family involvement. This could be relevant to the changing family routines and roles. Um, I would hold off and just visualize and imagine the families are involved, right? Or intensely involved in caring for the illness.
Yep.
All right, let's see. This is particularly hard on single parents. Oh, very short and sweet sentence. But there we go. That sounds like something that we've seen before, right? Sounds like paragraph 3.
Yeah, yeah. This I feel like finally establishes the main argument. Although the first kind of two paragraphs kind of lead us to that argument in the third paragraph, here we are finally mentioning it again, which is common, right? We've seen this before where the main argument is the main argument because it repeats, right? And so this is repeating in its own way, right? That it's negatively impacting single parents the most, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. Okay, parents have described difficulties maintaining family functioning and a sense of routine as they organize care and fit it into their family schedules with pre-existing day-to-day responsibilities. Now, this is coming back more general. We're just talking about parents in a general sense, not specifically single parents. Um, this almost kind of sounds like paragraph 5. Basically, it's difficult to navigate the illness with the normal routines and roles that the family has,
Right, right, definitely.
and it's hard on single parents. So it none of this feels super new. Definitely feels like paragraph 3. I'm getting hints of paragraph 5, but I don't see anything extremely unique to this paragraph now.
Yeah, they're not talking about money as much. That was like the factor in the first couple paragraphs. But
Hmm.
now it's not as much about money. It's more generally about how it negatively impacts them. So, okay,
Yeah, more on the people side than the financial side.
right.
Okay, let's take a look at our final sentence of paragraph 6. It says, in some cases, complex treatment regimens or severity of illness can restrict family activities. Okay, I mean, I again, it kind of fits with a like common sense way to think about it. Not too medical and scientific, but I think it kind of makes sense. If you're really, really sick, that's going to affect the family activities and roles and responsibilities. Again, paragraph 3 very strongly hit at in this paragraph, but also a little bit of paragraph 5, I would say. Nothing super new.
Sounds good. Yep. All right.
All right. Well, let's move on to our final paragraph. Paragraph 7. says, as the illness consumes a greater part of the parent's energy and time, many parents report lacking time to spend with siblings and are concerned about the negative impact this might have on them. Okay, now this is definitely new. And I can tell that because now we're talking about siblings. It's not about the child with the illness, and it's not about the parents anymore. It's not about the money. It's about the siblings, right? I guess it is involving the parents, but specifically, the parents don't have time with their other children as much, right? And they're worried that this could be a bad thing, right? So
Right.
we're worried about the siblings and the negative impact.
Right. And this kind of finally makes sense because they did mention in the fifth paragraph how the child's illness impacts the parent's functioning, and the parent's functioning also influences child adaptation. This is probably that child adaptation part, right?
Hmm.
Like where it's actually altering how they adapt to their children, right? They can't adapt to their children. They're negatively impacted by the child who has an illness, right?
Hmm.
Potentially, that's what I'm getting here. But you need to make that connection. No, it's not as clear. It's not as obvious. And as long as you just understand this idea in this paragraph, I think you'll be okay.
Yeah, and I almost feel like if they were to ask a question about it, like I know so many students are terrified of the really narrow CARS questions that like give you a quote, like what did the author mean by this quote? If you had that, let's just assume the worst. Let's say you had a question that said, what did the author mean by parental functioning also influences child adaptation? If you have a map, right? If you map it the way that we talk about in our, obviously in our course in depth, but also in our free sessions. Again, plug if you have not attended one of those, please do, because we'll talk about mapping in a little more depth. If you have some recollection of the arguments that are in the paragraph or in the passage, you'd look down and you ask, like, what do I have mapped that has anything to do with child adaptation? Right. And it's the closest thing is probably this paragraph. Okay. Even if you didn't pick up on what Jack just pointed out about that's probably what this is, even if in the worst case they gave you a specific question with a quote about this child adaptation, you could use elimination, right? This is probably the most relevant of any of the arguments that we bring up. So, given four answer choices, pick the one that has something to do with this and you're done, right? Even if you didn't pick it up in the moment, when you approach the questions, you use the map and you use elimination, you could still get the right answer, right? You don't need to be perfect, but you do need to use what you know to reason through what would be the best answer if you're caught off guard with a question like that.
Amazing point. Incredible point. Yeah. Yeah. You're focused, hyper focused on this paragraph because we don't really talk about siblings anywhere else, right?
Hmm.
It's the only time they talk about it. That's
Hmm.
the interesting thing about finding the main argument. There are going to be other arguments that are related that kind of help the main argument. This
Yeah.
sort of helps the main argument, right? Because if you think about it, if I wanted to convince you that parents who are single, right? Single parents are most negatively impacted by PCI. Wouldn't I want to point out that by being a single parent, and having a kid with chronic illness, that you're also going to like potentially not adapt or not be able to help other other children you have, like like the siblings of the piece of the kid that has PCI. So like this sort of establishes that negative impact more, right? Kind of
Mm-hmm.
further solidifies, hey, you know what? Maybe single parents are really most negatively impacted because they're also having a hard time with the siblings.
Hmm. Yeah, it definitely hints in that direction. Um, yeah, and they're all related. Okay, we've got, let's see, two more sentences in this passage, and then we can reflect on the main idea. Although I feel like, Jack, we already know what the main idea is, right? We've got so much support for that idea there in paragraph three, and what you just summarized, right? That single parents are the most impacted. Um, but let's see how the passage finishes out. This says, indeed, both mothers and fathers have identified giving emotional support to the child with cancer and to other children in the family as the most time consuming and difficult caregiving activities. Okay, so it sounds like mothers and fathers are spending a lot of energy with their children, especially the one with the illness, but also the other children. So again, it's a demanding thing. It's a lot of stress and burden to put on um, two parents. But again, like you said, this seems to make it very clear that if there was only one parent, this is going to be even more difficult. We haven't officially called it back to single parents yet, but if it's this hard on two people, imagine how hard it is on one, right? It's still indirect so far, but it's really helping support the idea that if you only have one person, this is going to be much more difficult.
All
We have
right.
one we have one other sentence, and it says single mothers in particular found it difficult to care for their ill child and plan activities for the rest of their family. And now we've brought it back to our idea in paragraph 3. Right? Single parents are the most impacted. Um, in this case, it's specifically single mothers. Um, but again, single parents are the most impacted. This idea that we have less time with our other children and that being a negative thing, this is something that single parents experience more than multi-child or multi-parent families. So we're back to paragraph 3, and then we have that other idea to track about having less time for your other kids.
Right. This kind of makes it clear, right?
Mm,
This is very obvious that it's single parents that have the biggest impact, right?
yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So that's our main argument, right? We've seen it time in and time out. Like single parents are more negatively impacted by pediatric chronic illness, and we understand the structure. I think that's really important, right? It's interesting. They didn't really define what a single parent is. They didn't.
Mhm.
That whole fourth paragraph, they never really went into it.
Yeah. I feel like that whole paragraph could just be gone and nothing would change.
Yeah, yeah.
Literally nothing, not a single point would change if paragraph 4 wasn't there.
Right, right. But we know what's going on. We have a big, if they do talk about siblings, like how are they impacted, we know it's the last paragraph, right? That's
Hmm.
a very hyper specific argument in the last paragraph, although
Yeah.
it does help the main argument. Uh,
Hmm.
and the financial stuff, they do mention that earlier on in the first paragraph and the second paragraph, but they don't really touch on it as much. I thought it was going to be more about finances, but it ended up not, right? And they ended
Hmm.
up using societal changes, this idea of demographic changes that now characterize our society in a more broad sense, not just
Hmm.
finance, not just
Yeah.
finance. So very interesting to point out. The author can go any way, any shape, any form. You just need to follow it along, right? And not bring in assumptions, not bring in your own ideas, right? Your own biases. That's the hardest part about this. And through practice, you'll get really good at it. And it's easier to practice this when the passage is completely irrelevant, right?
Yeah. Totally.
When it's something like this where you may have actually, read about this, maybe experienced this, maybe you were volunteering at a children's hospital, this hits home, right? And so you may bring in your own information, your own experiences into the passage, and you don't want to do that. You want to be careful with that. So yeah,
Hmm.
great read. This is, I think, a really good example of what you're going to see on the test.
Yeah, absolutely. And one other thing that jumped out at me with this passage, just because I help students with this particular problem all the time, like so many students would read the very first paragraph of PCI doesn't keep track or doesn't keep pace with demographic changes or social changes, and then they see the financial stuff and then all the stuff about single parents, and they're like, oh, let me pick the most broad idea. Like, let me say that paragraph 1 is my main idea because that involves the financial stuff and the single parent stuff and the rules being different and all that stuff. Like, paragraph 1 must be the main idea. But if you get a question, what is the main point? What is the main idea of the passage? It's going to be something about single parent families. It's not going to be something so broad because really the majority of the passage was very focused on this particular aspect of demographic changes influenced by PCI. So don't just always pick the broadest possible idea as your main idea. That's why Jack actually outlined all the strategies that we have of Find the thing that's the most supported, the most widespread. It doesn't have to be the most general statement that they make. It's the most commonly made and well supported idea that they make. I actually had done this passage with a student in the past, and that was their number one issue with it is they went with the most broad possible idea. And that may sway the performance on the questions. So keep that in mind. And also, please, as you guys wrap up this episode of our CARS Reading Skills Workshop, please make sure to click on the link. If you're listening to this on August 6th, this is the daily passage that we released for free on our website. You can navigate to jackwestin.com and access it there. Or if you prefer, you could click on the link that's in our description, and you can access this passage and the questions that we have associated, so that you can test your knowledge and test your understanding of the things that we just talked about. I'm very glad that we went over this passage. I feel like it has a lot of learning opportunities. We hope you enjoyed it, and we hope that you join us again for the next one. We have been doing these every single week, releasing the daily passages. Of course, you can check the passages out for the intervening days, jackwestin.com. But we hope you will join us again for our next CARS Reading Skills Workshop in the future. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.